All right. So it is exactly 12:30. So I know folks are still joining, but I want to kick us off because we have a wonderful panel here, and I want to give everyone plenty of time to hear from them. So as we do that, just a couple of logistics. Please ensure that you're muted on Zoom. If you have any questions, feel free to type those into the chat box. We are broadcasting live on Facebook, and we will also post this event on YouTube afterwards so that we can reach a broader section of our community. Thank you to our sponsors, Departments of Political Science and Philosophy here at College of Charleston. And I just want to start with a very brief land and labor acknowledgement. So our conversation today is all about what is hidden that we do not always name, systems built on historic injustices and inequities. And so I'd like to name the fact that we are gathering, albeit virtually, many of us in the Charleston area, on the unceded stolen land of First Nations people, including the Catawba, Chicora, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, Chicora Wakama, and Natchez Cuso. We are also on land stewarded by the Gullah Geechee peoples who were enslaved on the rice, indigo, and cotton plantations of the Sea Islands and the lower Atlantic coast. And our institution itself, College of Charleston, sits adjacent to the ports where at least 40% of enslaved people were trafficked, bought, and sold. It was built by enslaved peoples whose descendants were, until 1967, actively banned from attending the college. Through this land and labor acknowledgement, I pay my respects to elders, both past and present. I am a guest on this land, as are many of you, and it's our responsibility to acknowledge this legacy and actively work against the systems of oppression it perpetuates to this day. So with that, I have the distinct honor of introducing our host and moderator for this event, Mr. Keith Smalls. Keith Smalls is a community activist, mentor, speaker, and native of North Charleston. He is the founder and CEO of My Community's Keeper, a nonprofit group which is a collection of mentors, educators, advocates, and citizens who seek to improve their community and empower local youth. In addition, Mr. Smalls serves as a community representative for the Charleston County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council and an executive board member.
Thank you so much of the
criminal justice reform. Sorry, I could go on and on, Keith, you know this, about all of your active community board memberships, but with that, I will hand it over to you.
Great. And I was already talking while you was talking, so
it's
I appreciate it.
Too much going on, too many community partnerships, so please.
But today is definitely not about me. I'm honored to be a host and a moderator for this great conversation on the criminalization of poverty brought to you by the College of Charleston. I want to introduce our esteemed, our great and awesome panel of guests here. We start with Ms. Lydia Cotton, the Hispanic community representative for the Charleston County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. She's also a local community activist and the board chair for the Art Part Multicultural Group, which is a nonprofit organization who works with Latino and African American communities with art and resources to improve the community and police relationships. Hello, Lydia Cotton. Amber Johnson Esquire, she's the current serves as the Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation Manager for the City of Charleston since 2019. One thing that I loved about your bio, it speaks about results. You're results driven and you monitor the programs that you lead to ensure success and overall improvement of the city. I love results driven. Thank you for being here, Mrs. Johnson. Dr. Brianna McGinnis. Brianna McGinnis, make sure I'm correct, assistant professor of the College of Charleston. She teaches courses on political theory, both historical and contemporary constitutional law. Her work employs patterns of inclusion and exclusion and touching on related issues, including immigration, shared identity, and punishment. Also, we have with us Ali Menagauskas, founder of the South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform, former public defender in the state of Florida, as well as here in Charleston, South Carolina, presently a criminal attorney. Thank you, Ms. Ali Menagauskas, for being here. Also, we have Judge Alice Rico Flores, former administrative judge of the City of Charleston Municipal Court, also former prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, and immigration attorney. Now she works as the South Carolina Director of Systems Changes for Root and Rebound, which is a nonprofit organization working to restore power and resources, mostly um, honed by mass incarceration through legal advocacy, public education, policy reform, and litigation. Last but not least, we have Mrs. Josie Duffy Rice, journalist, lawyer, president of the Appeals, a news organization that publish stories about the criminal justice system. She's also the host of Justice in America podcast. Her writings on race, gender, and culture and politics have been featured in Vanity Fair, New York Times, Ebony, amongst others. She's also been featured in The Nation and New York Magazine. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for all for being here. We have an amazing hour. I expect it to be to talk about criminalization of poverty. We hope to learn a lot from this. I am not so much so new to it, but I'm definitely someone who's still learning. And I hope that everyone who's listening will definitely come away more informed about the criminalization of poverty. And then start this conversation, I want to start with you, Ms. Josie Duffy Rice. Definitely, I was doing some research on you and I looked at an interview that you did with Seth Meyers. And it was June 2020. And in the interview, you said, people will finally want to talk about what I've been trying to talk about for years. At that time, you were talking about the criminal justice reform and the criminal justice system. For all us being here, we're here for criminal justice, criminalization of poverty. Would you say the same thing applies to criminalization of poverty? Are people now finally beginning to have a conversation about this now, although this has been going on for quite some time now?
Yeah, I think, well, first, thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here with you all. I should say that a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time, so I don't want to make it sound like the implication is that it was just me or mainly me. I learned all about this from, decades of research and work by other people and lived experience. I think that when you think about Ferguson and we remember what we learned after Ferguson, many of us learned after Ferguson, right? That the entire city of Ferguson had basically been funding the municipal budget off the backs of poor people, brown people, and Black people. I mean, I think it was an arrest and a half for every citizen, or a citation and a half for every citizen in the city, and it really demonstrated just how much in an age of sort of post 2008 recession, right, in an age of austerity among states in this country, where especially the right has emptied out budgets and made it very difficult for cities to fund basic services. Cities have turned to criminalization. They have turned to the courts to fund their budget, right? And so I think that after Ferguson, that became more clear than it's ever been before. It's still happening all the time. It's laws like this get passed constantly. Fees and fines are imposed all the time. Privatization, not just of the prison system, but of community, what they call community supervision, parole and probation, has resulted in people paying daily, weekly, monthly fines for their ankle bracelet or for their check-ins. And there's no question that the criminalization of poverty and also the ways in which the criminal justice system engenders poverty creates a cycle where economic opportunity and economic mobility are even more limited than they are for certain populations. So I think it's hard for me to know what people are aware of, because this is what I do all day, every day. I don't watch sports. I don't really have hobbies. I just read about this all the time. So I'm not very clear on how the rest of the world thinks about some of this stuff all the time, because to me, it seems like the center of the universe. It's not the center of everybody's universe. But I do think that in the past couple of years, some of these terms, I mean, even that we're having this conversation is a sign that it's becoming a little bit more mainstream.
Yeah. Tell me about it. I think after serving 19 years in prison, I think my whole time in incarceration, it was always focused on, criminal justice reform and, the changing of the Truth in Sentence Act. It was just always that conversation in prison. But of course, that was one of the trouble and problems that we had in incarceration in prison, was getting the public eye to pay more attention to what we were, experiencing inside when it comes to the racial bias in the criminal justice system, and how it was distorted, against, those disenfranchised. But we talk about a little, about now people starting to begin to talk about it. And you said, of course, the conversation that's been going on. In researching, I kind of went to a Duke Law Journal article that was written by Professor Peter Edelman, wanted to pronounce his name right, law professor at Georgetown University. And he was speaking about the seeds of criminalization of poverty was sown until President Reagan was elected in 1981. But he also said mass incarceration began in the 1970s. Whether these numbers are true or not, something that he said in there was really interesting to me, and I want to kind of pass it along. He considered the criminalization of poverty the junior sibling of mass incarceration. To say that, I guess, that's the little brother of it. But so I kind of pass this along to Judge Elisa Rico Flores. What would you say to, it being the junior sibling of mass incarceration, being a former administrative judge, and what you experienced with the criminalization of poverty?
Well, I saw it, on the bench. I was on the bench for almost 9 years, and I saw individuals being charged for poor individuals being charged for engaging in what we all would consider life-sustaining activities: sleeping, urinating, asking for money so that you can get a snack for the day. And so I would wholeheartedly agree that whether or not a person receives a charge who is poor for engaging in an everyday life-sustaining activity is very real, and it should be called as it is, the criminalization of poverty. And there are other ways that we need to seek out to address these issues. And law enforcement, I'm sure, would rather not have to arrest an individual for sleeping in a parking garage, but they don't always have the necessary alternatives because there's not enough shelter space in the city for an individual to sleep at night. There's not enough public urinals in the city for an individual to relieve themselves as they go about their day, because they don't have a place to live, they don't have a place to sleep. And you enter into this cycle of arrest or tickets and fines and fees that you have absolutely no ability to ever pay off. And it just perpetuates the cycle.
Yeah, I mean, correct on all course, and I can only imagine, you being a municipal court judge and sitting and watching this. But now I would think, as a director of systems change for roots and rebounds, you definitely have an opportunity to affect this what would you call it, this tragedy. Is just, I think, a word that was used on your show, Mrs. Duffy Rice, was that it was an intense, I think your co-host, Clint Smith, he said that it was, I think he called it, I want to make sure I get it right. I know he spoke about it, and I was just like, I like how the word that he used, and he said it was such intense. He said it was a tragic consequences, and intense, you know what I'm saying, as far as, and what it does in the individual life and the lives of families. I want to kind of pass it along to Mrs. Amber Johnson, Esquire, as a equity, inclusion, and racial conciliation manager for the city of Charleston. We speak on a local, I guess, on a local viewpoint of it. What is the take that the city, as of as now, it takes on the criminalization of poverty? I see the Mayor Tecklenburg recently, in a 2020 initiative, he just invoked some policies that, we think that would help. What are your takes on where the city stands now on the criminalization of poverty?
My take on it is that the city has made equity a priority. In creating my position and my role, we talk about how do we protect our most vulnerable residents? How do we look at our programming and our policy, our ordinances, and consider who's benefiting and who's burdened by them? So the criminalization of poverty, it's a conversation that I've been having. We've been discussing how we reform fines and fees and what that looks like for the city, and how complicated it can be. We think that it can be, it's just like a simple thing to change, but then we think about the interactions between the city and the county and the state and what that looks like, and then trying to figure out what that's going to look like for the city. So it's a conversation that we're having. We definitely are not there yet, but I think if we continue to work and continue to prioritize the people who live here, I think that we'll get there eventually, but we definitely have work to do.
Yes, definitely has work to do. That leads me to Dr. Brianna McGinnis, professor at the College of Charleston. A lot of your teachings on political theories and whether historic or contemporary, but I think more on the topic of what caught my attention was the related issues on immigration and shared identity and punishment. When it comes to the criminalization of poverty, how do you, I guess, bridge, what you teach to being able to, bring some insight and knowledge to the criminalization of poverty?
Thanks, Keith. So that's a good question. So these seem in some ways like maybe disparate or unrelated topics: immigration, punishment, poverty, but they aren't. They are all centered on who is treated as an equal citizen, right, or an equal member of a community. And so one of the issues with the criminalization of poverty is that it targets, in particular, people who are housing insecure, right, or people who are already living in a marginalized situation economically, who then might become housing insecure. And I think one of the biggest political issues to overcome, just as far as getting the political will or the democratic will to address some of these problems through the legislative process, is the tendency of more affluent people, or people who are, even people who aren't that affluent, but who are like 1 or 2 paychecks themselves, away from potentially serious, like economic problems or homelessness, is getting them to view homeless people or people who are housing insecure or unhoused as being fellow citizens. Too often, binary is drawn between citizens and disorderly people, or citizens and criminals. And I think like one of the big challenges is getting us to recognize, I really like that Ms. Johnson just referred to the people that we're discussing today as being fellow residents, right? Because they're our neighbors, and we owe them equal recognition.
Yeah, good stuff. Really good stuff. I definitely want to turn this to Ali Menegauskis. I seen recently, I think the day yesterday, I think you had a post and you were talking about prosecuting debtor prisons. And studying for this talk, I looked at what was listed as some of the 10 solutions for in criminalization of poverty, and it was, one of them was the prosecution debtors prisons and ban for profit probations. And again, I've heard you ad nauseum talk about some of these things. What is your take on the criminalization of poverty, and and reflecting on some of the things that you spoke on and researched and experienced?
Keith, thank you so much for having me here. And it's such a pleasure to be among such fantastic, intelligent female leaders in our state and our country here. It's a pleasure. It's a great question, Keith. And, my background is just as a lawyer, as a public defender. But one of the reasons that, I left public defense and wanted to go private and eventually open a nonprofit for reform is because I saw a lot of the problems when it comes to the system, criminalizing poverty, but also criminalizing other things that lead to poverty, such as mental health issues, such as substance use, etc. What I loved was what Miss Duffy said. It's not just, that we have, that we're criminalizing poverty, but there's a system in place that engenders poverty. And that's really what I focus on, not just those ordinances that disparately impact those that may be homeless or don't, or maybe transient, such as, potentially disorderly conduct or disturbing the peace or trespassing, right? Those are going to disparately impact people that maybe don't have a place to live and are stuck on the street, but also other crimes that can affect, all of us, whether we, have a decent income or not. The biggest one is licenses, driver's licenses. And I know a lot of us here have done research on that, is that there are so many fines, not just in this state, but many other states that punish people by fining them through their driver's license and suspending their driver's license. Things like not paying your child support can suspend your driver's license. What happens when your license is suspended? You can't drive to work to make money to pay your child support, right? So it's engendering poverty, keeping poverty continuing, making this revolving door of criminal activity. But I think, I want to bring up this one example. It does not just affect people that may not be employed. Yesterday, I was in a local magistrate's court, and I was sitting there and I see one person after the other without representation. That's a big problem we have here in South Carolina, is that there is not enough indigent representation for people on the lower level courts, such as municipal magistrate courts. And then finally, I see this young woman who says, I want a public defender. And so the judge is looking through her sheet and says, looks like you make $22,000 a year. Yes, ma'am, I'm a preschool teacher. I've got one child and I pay rent and everything. Well, unfortunately, ma'am, you don't qualify for a public defender under this evaluation. Turns out that, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, I said, Judge, does that indigency affidavit ask how many bills she has a month? Ask what debt she has. It turns out it didn't. And someone making $22,000 a year, how could they possibly afford a lawyer when they have to take care of their kid in school and daycare? They have to pay their rent. It affects people that are employed, people that may not have the money we knew. And I know Judge Flores is nodding here because we talk about this all the time, and the need for representation. So it affects so many parts of our system. I'm going to stop because I could go on and on. Thank you.
I made sure I brought this out. After serving 19 years in prison, coming home and realizing that I had, fines over fines for tickets that I had, 19 years ago, and that still hindered me from getting a driver's license. So of course that experience is definitely, taken to heart right there. This is Lydia Cotton. I wanted to turn to you. One of the solutions that they talked about, and I guess curing, criminalization of poverty, they talked about prohibiting profiling, but they talked about it on the basis of housing. But I thought about it on the basis of race. Of course, I think that's the the most important way to look at it, because it comes from the disenfranchised, and when you look at the Latino community, and what we all know, all the profiling that is done, in the effects of criminalization of poverty. What do you think is, one of the biggest things that, Latinos face when it comes to criminalization of poverty? Is it just the housing? Is it just based on race? What would you say to?
I'm going to try to explain it in a simple and difficult at the same time, whether we agree or not, or whether we decide to take one side or the other. We gotta have to listen to the following. A Latina like me, they have a ticket, traffic ticket. We pay $230 something if I don't pay, but then I have other issues. But a family where, let's think about the children, the citizen children, a family that doesn't have the documentation, he goes to the jail, pay the $235, then has to pay $10,000 a month for immigration, and they have to pay $5,000 more, whatever, for attorney. So what that happens, and when I see hundreds of families have to move from, by the way, they cannot get an apartment because, you have to be citizen to get a nice apartment, nice place to live, or decent place to live. Living in a trailer park, in a mobile home, move to another mobile home, live that, and all those children, all those families, 2 families, 3 families, 4 families. Okay. So I'm not thinking here about the loss. I'm thinking about the children, which, by the way, they're citizens with no help when it comes to mental issues, when it comes to child abuse, and when it comes to many things that happen. So I really feel that one thing it comes to another is very difficult for citizens like me, but behind me, there's a lot more that we need to start looking into. That's why I appreciate this panel, which, by the way, is teaching me. But I want to bring the message that when it comes to this topic, the Latino, Hispanic, grassroots, documented or not, it has to be listened to, and it has to look at it as well, and it has to be respected, but especially listened to. So I want to thank you for that. Those are just a tip. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cotton. I want to go back to Ms. Duffy Rice. I listened to one of your podcasts. It was on the criminalization of poverty. I think it was episode 12. And in there, I like what you did in the beginning. You do this on every one of your episodes. You talk about the word of the day. The word of the day for that day was recidivism. Something I know so well of being a community rep for the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, and also my work with SC4CJR, of course. But you talked about it, the simplistic of it. I think your co-host talked about the simplistic of the word and what it implies, right? But when you say the criminalization of poverty, we understand by listening here, whether it's homelessness, tickets, criminal justice, there's multiple layers of the criminalization of poverty. But the underlying factor, is there such thing as an underlying factor of the criminalization of poverty? Or is it just the multi-dimension of one thing over another?
I think if I understand your question, that it's my read on this is that it's multi-dimensional, that it is a way of, to your point about recidivism, right? The reason I'm not a fan of the word recidivism is because, or recidivist, is because I think it's a simple way to describe, too simple way to describe something very complicated. If you go to prison for murder and then later you're arrested for having expired tags, are you technically recidivist? Sure, but what does that tell us about you? What does that tell us about change? Not to mention that a lot of the statistics about recidivism are misleading. But one of the ways that people get stuck in this system, right, is the criminalization of poverty and like the technical violations that drive involvement with the system. You look at Dante Wright, right, who was killed just a few days ago, and he had a warrant out for unpaid fines. It's just constant that it is a way of preventing people from actually moving, being able to re-enter society in a full way, and it's an easy way to pull them back in to the system. In Georgia, where I live, we have the most people under correctional control in the country, but actually most of that is not prison or jail. Most of it is probation and parole, and that's because our probation and parole sentences are drastically longer than most states. Other states average is 5 and ours is 9. And one of those people who has been on, I've kind of watched go through the parole system here is my brother, who got arrested at 21 and then got 15 years probation and 15 years of parole, and is recently off of parole as of maybe like 8 months ago. but it was just a constant struggle. There were days where he didn't have an apartment and he didn't really have any money and he couldn't really get a job. And then if he slept in his car, he would be arrested for homelessness. You know, you see sit, sleep, lie laws. In some places, it's illegal to be downtown if you're homeless. And there are literally geographic limitations of where you can stay. You know, there was a case here in Georgia a few years ago of a guy who was panhandling and spent the next 96 days in prison or in jail. It is just such a mechanism for catching people and the tentacle like monster that is the criminal justice system. And I think it's a mistake to imply that, you know, I think that we sometimes pay attention to certain issues at the exclusion of others, even when other issues are driving the system. But I do think that what criminalization of poverty does is what low-level drug offenses do, right? Which is that they get you in. And so maybe that's not the reason you end up spending 10 years in prison, but it's the reason you get your first and second offense so that you get 10 years for your third offense, right? It's the reason that everything that happens after that is just multiplied. And for me, watching my brother, one thing I really thought about all the time is like, he doesn't want to be sleeping in his car. He has no interest in sleeping in his car, right? If the state's goal, just imagine the state's real goal was to make sure people weren't homeless, right? They would have the same goal as him. He wanted a job. He wanted a place to stay. He wanted a place where he could shower, right? But instead, it demonstrates that that can't possibly be the way to ensure that people aren't homeless by criminalizing them. It can't possibly be the way to ensure, you know, that people have the ability to get a job by making them pay $10 a day for their ankle bracelet, right? It just is such an, I mean, to the point about child support. If you know, can't pay your child support and then you can't have a job and then you can't see your kids, like what is our goal here and what are we actually trying to do? So I think it is multifaceted. I think like everything, it comes back to money, like a lot of things, it comes back to money. And it's just another kind of tactic to ensure that it's very difficult to get out of here, get out of the system.
I hope I completely agree that it's multifaceted. I think I did a class in prison called The Politics of Reality. And I spoke about Ronald Reagan and I spoke about multiple other things. But, you know, can we say it's a political issue? Is it as easy as, you know, changing policies and legislation? You know, I think in the elimination of criminalization of poverty, in the article I read, the number one thing they said was overhauling local justice administration. As a former judge, Ms. Flores, would you say that would be number one, or would that just be, you know, something that we definitely need to talk about in order to eliminate the criminalization of poverty?
I think we have to have a multifaceted approach. And I loved Marin's introduction because I don't think you can have a conversation about the criminalization of poverty without talking about systemic racism. And because from the beginning, from day one, Blacks and Brown are at a disadvantage. We're treated that way. We are discriminated against, which affects our ability to get employed and affects our ability to hold positions of power within society. And it starts there and it sort of just keeps going. So if I'm at a disadvantage, I may end up homeless. May end up unemployed. I may end up targeted in my neighborhood, which is typically over policed. And I may end up in a place where an individual of a different race would never find themselves. So we have to take a multifaceted approach. One is dealing with our own biases. One is dealing with our structural systems that continue to perpetuate racism. But yeah, sure, we could look at it administratively. That's one of the things that we do at Root and Rebound. We take several different approaches. One is through education. One is approaches through direct representation. Another is through policy reform. Another is through, I think I said direct representation and litigation, filing lawsuits to try to correct the systems that have perpetuated the disadvantages that the poor and the minorities have experienced within this country. So we have to approach it, we have to tackle it at a few different angles.
I totally agree to the multifaceted approach about it. I think it's no easy fix, and it's not one way to fix, the elimination of the criminalization of poverty. But I think number 10 on that list, if that list is accurate or inaccurate, it does give some good pointers. I like to think. It talks about creating alternatives. Mrs. Johnson, in that position, with the manager for the city of Charleston, I think you spoke about that, creating alternatives, with the new initiatives with the city. Can you speak a little bit more about some of the things that the city is doing to create alternatives here locally when it comes to the criminalization of poverty?
I think the biggest thing that we've been working on most recently has been our Special Commission on Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation. It's a committee of 6 council members, 7 community members, and then each of those community members are leading 7 subcommittees. Those committees include criminal justice reform, healthcare, education, economic empowerment. And so, as we discussed earlier, all of those things intersect, and they lead to what has become the criminalization of poverty. So once we look at these systems individually, we have to discuss how we dismantle those systems so that we are able to create these initiatives. So through this special commission, each of those subcommittees are coming up with recommendations about how we advance racial equity within the city of Charleston. And that's been the biggest part of our work, is just coming up with these recommendations so that they can go directly to city council and to the mayor about changes that are needed and that are wanted by community members, because they're coming directly from the community.
Okay. Mrs. Menegauskis, in your bio, you talked about how in the state of Florida, the criminal justice system and, the witnesses of the injustices and kind of, which you faced in Florida, kind of propelled you and pushed you, further and, deeper into wanting to, change and do more. And coming to South Carolina, Charleston, specifically, you realize that the criminal justice defenders here and inmates face even greater odds. The greater odds creates, I think, a situation for, more hardship when it comes to changing it. What do you see the landscape of criminalization of poverty now, especially comparably to what Mrs. Johnson is saying with the city of Charleston and their new initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Keith, and thanks, Amber. I'm actually on one of the subcommittees for the criminal justice for the Special Commission in Charleston, and we have a great group, and it's a great think tank putting together ideas. But yeah, I mean, my introduction to the criminal justice system was in Florida, which Florida is far from a perfect system. They have a very strict mandatory minimums, criminal punishment code, score sheets. I had a client once there that, despite having 25 years with no criminal history, was scoring a minimum of 3 years in prison for driving under a suspended license. He ended up having to plead guilty to a year because he had no choice there. But here, the landscape's a little different. And, I talk about the due process thing. That's what a lot of our focus at South Carolina for criminal justice reform, not just research, education, collaboration, but also how does the due process system criminalize the poor, or as Ms. Duffy so eloquently said it, engender poverty. Here, one big difference that, you know, Keith, I talk about all the time, and is my big thing, a lack of a speedy trial rule. Ms. Duffy, you know, I'm sure you're aware too, here, we don't have any kind of rule when it comes to speedy trial. Of course, we have a US constitutional right to a speedy trial, but it doesn't delineate how long that can be. Our Supreme Court in South Carolina has held that 2 years is not a violation of speedy trial. And in fact, in Charleston County, which is one of the more well-funded counties in the state, before COVID, the average wait time for a jury trial was over 2.5 years. Now imagine, you know, we haven't even gotten into the bond system here, but imagine if you have even a low level amount of bond, let's say $2,500 for a low level offense, which would be remarkably low bond in this county, and you don't have any money to pay that. You don't have family that can pay that amount of bond to a bondsman. And so what are you going to do? Even if you're innocent, which frankly is not the point, if you want to exercise your constitutional right to a trial, are you willing to wait over 2.5 years sitting in jail so you can exercise that right? Most people don't. And that was one of the really terrifying things that I saw when I first came here. In Florida, I tried over 70 cases in my first year as a public defender. Here, there's public defenders that haven't tried a case in 3 years. Why is that? It's because there is no sense of urgency. There's no reason to push cases along because there is no minimum time or maximum time that people have to be tried before the case is dismissed. So a lot of people end up pleading guilty, as Alicia Flores knows, just to get out of jail. And then what does that mean? You know, we talk about that word that we don't like, the recidivism, right? Because it's so complex. You're pleading guilty, and then you develop a criminal record. And the next time you're not going to get a good deal, and you're probably going to be looking at more prison time, more jail time, more probation time. So there's a lot of things here that we need to change in the system, the court system, that disparately impacts the poor. I'm going to say one more thing. Alicia, our thing is, we talk about this all the time. One thing I never saw in Florida till I came here is people being tried in their absence. I don't know, Ms. Duffy, if you guys have that a lot down there. I see it every day here. If someone does not come to their court date, especially in that local municipal level, but also Keith himself, he was tried in his absence and ended up serving 19 years. He wasn't even there for his trial. And that happens every day here. If you are, whether you're homeless or you're transient or you're moving constantly, as we know, people who are lower income tend to move more frequently, you are not noticed. You do not see that notice of your court date. You miss that court date. You're found guilty in your absence. And unless you appeal it within, I think, what is it, 7 days or something, Judge Flores, you're stuck with that conviction. 10 days, thank you. So there are some, frankly, I mean, yes, we need a multifaceted report, but there are some simple fixes that are not that difficult to obtain that we can get through the legislature. We can get through local courts, which we're trying to do with Ms. Johnson and the committees there, but simple ordinance, simple statutory changes that we can be focusing on that will really make a huge difference for people and try and at least reduce the disparate impact for minorities and for those that are lower income.
Thank you. Yeah. 29 years I received as a trial in absentia. Definitely. And this was in 2000. So, you know, this has been going on. I think it's a travesty. It's a humiliation that a person can be tried in his absence. And there's so many different things that, you know, we, you know, look at when we talk about my case. And can only imagine, not even imagine, you know, what goes on in other people's case. I totally believe. There are any questions from the panelists? I wanted to go to Professor McGinnis, Dr. McGinnis. I kind of said in the beginning about, you know, the phrase criminal justice reform, and I was referring to Ms. Duffy Rice and how I think it's like a political catchphrase now. You know, everybody uses the word criminal justice reform in the political, you know, jargon and, you know, in campaigns. But we don't hear too much of the word decriminalization of poverty. As a professor, you know, is this a of course, I would think that, we hear about criminal justice reform now in schools. I think it's trickled down through communities. But the criminalization of poverty, is this a conversation? Is this something that kids are talking about in the colleges, in your classrooms, in your hallways? Do you experience any of that?
So another good question. So this has changed. I have noticed even in the past, like I'm still fairly early in my career, but even in like the past 4 or 5 years. So I teach this class called Democracy and Discipline, where we talk about how punishment is political, right? And this used to be a really hard sell when I first started teaching this class. And increasingly, I find that students are more amenable to that, which I find actually very encouraging, because I think one of the problems with the criminalization of poverty, as I was saying in my like previous comments, is that it seems far away to a lot of people. A lot of people seem to think that this is not their problem, but I think that's changing with younger people because of work like that being done at the Appeal. There's more public awareness of how like grossly unjust these things are. Like I'm listening to Allie talk and I'm just like sitting here, I'm like getting angry. And I think the same thing is happening to a lot of young people, but then the trick is to translate that outrage into action. One of the problems with the criminalization of poverty is that we're often like looking at populations who are either formally disenfranchised or sort of like de facto disenfranchised, right? So people in prison in most states can't vote. People who have criminal records, especially felonies, in some states can't vote. But there are all these sort of like informal ways that they're also cut out of the political process. And so I guess this is a long answer to your short question, which is that yes, I do see students thinking more about this, which I think is promising. And I hope that the next step beyond sort of like thinking about this and talking about it and posting things to Instagram is using the political leverage that they have to pressure their legislators to do these things that Ms. Metagakis was talking about, right? Like talking about changing due process doesn't necessarily inspire people, to run to the barricades, but that's the next step, right? Is putting political pressure on people who can pull those levers.
Thank you. And I mean, that's a joy. I think that's all that we can hope for. Watching protests around America and the nation as we, protest the injustices of, these recent murders. Even locally, we have, experienced our days and time of protest. And we've witnessed this. I think me and Ali sat on the front line and multiple times in different protests, that a lot of people who are out there were younger students. And some of them didn't necessarily know what they were there for, but they were just happy to be involved. And that's all right. But I think it's better that we learn what we're fighting for, so that we can have a better understanding when the mic's in our face and, when it's our time to have a conversation about it. And that kind of takes me to you, Mrs. Cotton. Lydia, as you kind of do your very best as a liaison for the Latino community to be able to, educate them and, make them understand the criminalization of poverty, and the effects and the things that they can do to kind of help themselves as far as Latinos in those communities. Is there something, from this talk that you would hope to take, or that if you haven't, is there a question or something that you want to ask that would help you better, be able to educate those in which, you hope to educate from your community?
I wish everybody stop thinking that Latino needs to be the last. I wish every city have somebody Latino they can speak up for the Latino community. Not a volunteer, not me, not anybody who just can be there for a few hours. Pay for it. By every city, it should have a Latino to represent more than 23 countries. Okay, and I wish that the Latino population, the Hispanic population, the grassroots, work with their fear, because it's all fear. It's about fear. The issue is not tension, it's fear. So unless we really want to take account on the Hispanic Latino community. If any agency doesn't have a Latino right there, talking about the issues, we just are making a mistake, because all those children, which by the way, there are a lot, and it's going to be a big number in the future, is going to come back to us with mental issues, mental problems. So my message is to definitely the Hispanic community needs to take responsibility and work on getting on their feet and trust that we can do it together peacefully, in order, representing the way that we like to do with a lot of honor. But definitely, please, this state needs to change, starting with the small cities. If a Latino is not in your table, if the grassroots is not on your table, talking about our issues, our problems, if we keep putting our hands on the ears and thinking that we just a little number, there's 2 or 3, there's none, there's some politics, it's a mess and it's disgraceful. So what I want to say is this: you need to have a Latino next to you, because practically you know nothing about Latinos. We need to teach you, and we need to get the respect of that. So respectfully, I ask for that, because without that, we got to keep being the last one in the list, the last one in the line, the least that we don't care. And it doesn't work that way, because you know what? 2050 is coming. We know the numbers. It's going to change.
Thank you. I have to piggyback off that. I think in the criminal justice reform circle, those who are previously incarcerated, we have a tendency of believing that criminal justice reform starts with having previously incarcerated at the table. I don't think you can have the conversation about criminal justice reform without having someone who was previously incarcerated at the table. But of course, that conversation is going on and on and on. Oh, okay, that's just a comment there. I want to go to Mrs. Duffy Rice. We only have like 8 minutes left. Hopefully we can get a final thoughts from everybody on the panel. But I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about the popularity of it. The criminal justice reform phrase, token phrase, mass incarceration even. It has a sense of popularity in the political circles now. People are talking about it. Is coming from a land on a national from a national standpoint. Is the criminalization of poverty being talked about more now? Or should we be optimistic that it is, or should we be like, kind of figuring how we can have more forums like this and opportunities to have actually the in criminalization of poverty as the main topic of conversation?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think that it is being talked about more now. As others have said, it does seem like it's growing and getting more attention. I think, again, I'm not always the best person to ask, because my world is so focused on this. But I do think it's being talked about more now. I would say that, like, in most places in this country, right, there are people doing this work on the ground, right? And that everybody who, at least for me, as a journalist and the people that I'm around, like, we are learning from community members. We are learning from people who are accountable to people within their community, right? That's a different, that's being driven by real organizers, by real activists, and they I think this is a priority issue for many of them. It might not be a priority in every place. It might not be the focus in every place, but I do think it's getting more focus. I think this conversation is shifting, right? The criminal justice conversation is shifting. The conversation we're having today is not the conversation we had 10 years ago. We're having, people are thinking about this in different ways. And so I think that includes expanding the topics, and that, like, I think at least some people understand the ways that poverty and criminalization interact now. But I think in general, we are just open to bigger changes, more a real rethinking of what the system could look like.
Good stuff. Good stuff right there. And I definitely second that. I think this issue here is definitely a worthy conversation, but it's not something that I think, you know, we have so many different things that we can kind of go at when it comes to, the biases in the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform as a whole. I want to kind of get to final thoughts. I think we have like 5 minutes left, and we want to kind of, this has been a fast, quick hour. I hope that we were able to touch on, some the topics, but whatever we were able to talk with, I definitely wanted to get some final thoughts from each of the panelists. And I want to start with you, Mrs. Flores. Restoring power and resources, roots and rebounds. Can you, any final thoughts that you want to add to the criminalization of poverty in this talk?
Yeah, regarding your question about heightened awareness, I think I think people are becoming aware of the inequalities within our society, which leads us to examine the systems that we have in place. And unfortunately, through the death of Walter Scott, of Breonna Taylor, of now Dante Walker, we have Dante Wright. We have right now in the midst of a trial with that involved the death of, or the murder of, George Floyd. And each of these are I think, when these events happen, they open up a dialogue and they make us ask hard questions about what can we do differently? What could we have done to save this person's life? How could we have viewed them more with humility and compassion? What are the questions that we need to ask that will lead to systemic, lasting change? And I think this was wonderful today. I have enjoyed hearing from all of the participants, because every single person here on the panel had useful information that I will take away and I will use in order to promote the change that we need to address the criminalization of poverty. So thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mrs. Menegowski's final words, please.
Having these conversations is the best place to start. I think all of us said, when I first started as a public defender 8 years ago, there wasn't even really the term criminal justice reform wasn't really circulated. When I told my family and well, not as much my family, but when I told people and colleagues that I wanted to be a public defender, they kind of scoffed at me and said, why don't you become a prosecutor? Now I have interns from the College of Charleston and from the Charleston School of Law and all over the state that have gone to school to become public defenders. What a cool world we live in now. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth, and we're all learning. That's what, our main focus is at South Carolina for criminal justice reform. We really do believe that if people are informed of these issues, they're going to take the initiative to want to change them. They're going to contact their legislatures, and they're going to be ready to vote when the time comes. So having these huge collaborations with great other organizations and academics and city stakeholders is a great first start. I do want to chat a little bit because there is a bill that definitely affects, the criminalization of poverty. If you don't know what civil asset forfeiture is, there's a bill right now that some of us here are supporting that is trying to change the rules when it comes to civil asset forfeiture. Really basic. If you get arrested or charged and there's a suggestion that your property, your money, your car, your house is involved somehow in criminal activity, it can be taken away, kept, and sold to fund that local police department that arrested you. It lends itself to serious corruption and funds a lot of our local agencies all over the country and all over the state. So that's one thing that you can look at in the legislature that's here this year. And a lot of organizations have put a lot of work into that. But next step, let's stop criminalizing people through their driver's license and stop fining people through their driver's license. And I think that's going to make a huge difference in our jail populations. And it's going to make a huge difference in ending this revolving door of poverty. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Professor McGinnis, any final words?
Well, thank you very much for having me here also. It's been a pleasure and I've learned a lot. I'm just going to keep kind of like pounding on the same drum I always pound on, which is to say, you know, Americans love to talk about equality and liberty, and the criminalization of poverty is just like such a just grotesque violation of both of those things, that any, like, the people who think that this is not their problem should recognize that this is everybody's problem.
Definitely everybody's problem. Mrs. Amber Johnson, any final words, please?
I would just add that at the City of Charleston, we've started this journey of talking about how we prioritize people, how we look at how we make our most vulnerable residents our priority. And that's a conversation and a journey that we're just starting, but something that we're committed to. So I think through that work, we're just going to continue to beat the pavement and just continue to have these conversations about how we dismantle these systems that have been harming the majority of the people that live here. So I'd like to thank everybody for having this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it.
Good stuff. And last but not least, Mrs. Josie Duffy Rice, final words now.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me, and this has been really interesting and great. So thank you. I would just, I would encourage people to recognize all the different ways that this happens, right? Sometimes it's through the legislature, sometimes it's through prosecutorial discretion, sometimes it's through the police kind of, you know, enacting their own sort of internal policies against people. Sometimes, you know, it happens in so many different ways, locally, state, federal, different kind of players and different government bodies. And the more you can be aware of what people are experiencing, the more you can be aware of the different ways in which criminalization and poverty is criminalized in your jurisdiction, and the more you can hold people accountable, that's kind of like our main tool, right, for dismantling some of this stuff. The criminal justice system is so opaque, and why we kind of started the appeal was because we recognize that even if you're a journalist, it's hard to know all sort of the ins and outs of the system, especially if you don't have like a legal background. It's opaque on purpose, right? And accountability is a rare thing in these systems. And so the more that you do your research and ask questions and push back on policies and practices that you find harmful and that you see as contributing to the cycle of poverty that exists, the more, I think, hopefully, the more equitable the system becomes.
Great stuff. And thank you all again for being such great guests here. Thank you for all the work that you do in your community, individually, collectively. We look forward to hearing from each and every one of you all again on this journey. You know, the article that I took some of my research from was called Decriminalization of Poverty. Much more to do, and what this conversation lets us know that there is much more to do. We need more people fighting this ugly, you know, this ugly position of the place that we are in. I just wanted to quickly add, Mrs. Cotton, you said something about fear. This book here, Michael Creighton, The State of Fear, is a great read and talks about the state of fear. I've talked to Mr. Menegauskas about that. Go to Appendix 1, and it talks about the theory of eugenics, and you know what I'm saying, and some really good stuff that gives us a thought pattern of who we are up against, what we are up against, because we are definitely up against something that is very big. It's a system that is designed and it's working perfectly, and we have to do all that we can to get the imperfection working out of it. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Keith Smalls. I am the founder and executive director of My Community's Keeper Mentor Group, a nonprofit organization here working locally in the Charleston County and abroad on criminal justice issues, gun violence issues. And we are here trying to do all that we can in collaborative with, you know, all the beautiful people here that we hope to be able to share with. Thank you for the College of Charleston for hosting this, for having us. And we all ask you all to have a great day. Be safe. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.